Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about notable racing deaths and their impact on Formula One safety. Francois Cevert, Ronnie Peterson, Didier Pironi, Gilles Villenueve. I recently read an article in Road and Track which had me thinking about previous eras of F1 where crashes and death were common. I think new fans of the sport don't necessarily understand the continuing impact these deaths have had on the sport's safety. Dick remembers many of these crashes and provides insights as to how the sport has progressed over time. But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Dick, I am looking forward to what I think will be kind of a hard conversation in one sense because we're thinking about something quite morbid. But my hope is that it'll inspire other F1 fans by hearing your take on this. And it comes because I recently read this article in Road and Track. It was called The Lasting Legacy of Formula One's Tragic Hero, Francois Cevert.
Cevert, yep.
Cevert. And it had me thinking about previous eras of F1 where crashes and death were much more common, unfortunately, than they are now. Like, meaning it's unfortunate that they even had any crashes. Yep. And I think new fans of the sport don't necessarily understand how that was for racers and teams and even spectators, like the fans. So I wanted to pose this to you. If we could discuss some of the notable racers who died in crashes like Cevert, Ronnie Peterson, Didier Pironi, and Gilles Villeneuve. And maybe you could give some perspective on that. Let's kind of go through like the who, the what, where, when, why did this crash happen, and how did it affect the sport? So I've given you a pretty tall order, but I have confidence in your capability to school me on this aspect of racing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really interesting comment. And there are other drivers who actually were killed who, because of their death and the circumstances of their death, it made the sport take a step back and say, okay, this is just not acceptable. What can we do to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again? And Francois Cevert was a great example of that. Whereas Ronnie Peterson, Didier Pironi, and Gilles Villeneuve, all of them, while tragic and everybody was just sort of like, oh my God, they were racing accidents. Peterson was killed at the very start of the Italian Grand Prix in 1978. He had, qualified his Lotus, in the top 6, I think it was, something like that. Anyway, we all know how Monza is. You go rushing down the straightaway, you got a braking zone at the very end. Everybody's going really quick, and inevitably there's some carnage there in the first couple of corners. It never fails, right? And Ronnie got speared, I believe, by Riccardo Patrese. And one thing led to another, and big crash. Ronnie was pulled out, but then he died of his injuries a couple of days later. Villeneuve was on a qualifying lap, very much at war with his teammate, which was Didier Pironi. And, he was just going for it, and in true Villeneuve fashion. And he came across a car that had just gone out on the track, was moving very slowly. And, Villeneuve zigged when he thought the other guy was going to zag, and it didn't work quite that way. And massive accident. Villeneuve, was, killed instantly by the impact. And, but it was a racing accident, and I think racers understand that there's a difference between a racing accident versus an accident that should have been survivable, but something else happened that caused them to be killed. Same sort of situation with Pironi as well. But when you think about it, there were a number of guys that died where you really were sort of like, you never thought that guy would die. And there's a rare breed of these guys that are like that. And Jim Clark was one of them. Jim was a 2-time world champion. He won the Indy 500 from Scotland. And back in the 60s, there weren't that many Grand Prix. There were like 9 or 10 every year, right? They were actually fairly rare. And so racing drivers would fill their time in running touring cars or running in Formula 2, believe it or not. I mean, can you imagine Lewis Hamilton racing a Formula 2 race because he had an off weekend and didn't have anything else to go do?
No,
and, I mean,
not at all.
Right. And that's what these guys would do. I mean, it would be like half the Formula 1 grid would go run a Formula 2 race because they got paid to race. And so they'd show up and they'd go race. They weren't on, these retainers where, you do your 10 races and you're making your millions. And these guys were paid, a very modest sum every time they got in a car and raced it. But it wasn't like they had a season long deal. And I mean, that was changing in the 60s, but there was still a very unusual thing. And many times they would have a combination where it was a salary, but then if you did more races, you got paid extra, one of those things. So anyway, Jim Clark, two-time world champion, Indy 500 winner, won all sorts of races. April of 1968, he was driving in a Formula 2 race at the Hockenheim Ring in Germany in the rain. And on about the fifth or sixth lap, for reasons that are still unknown today, he just went off the track at high speed into a forest. And of course, hit several trees and was killed instantly, basically. And so nobody really knew what happened then, and nobody knows what happened today. But they actually brought in a company that studies airplane wrecks for 3 weeks, and they couldn't figure it out. The best they could come up with was he had a tire that was deflating, and it suddenly lost a whole bunch of air pressure and sent him off the track and into the trees. Well, this is sort of the start of barriers being put in place between the track and the areas off the track. There have been attempts to address this in the past, but when you look at it, it would be the placement of the barriers could be sporadic. The types of the barriers could be like straw hay bales, or you could have steel guardrails, or you could have concrete blocks. You just never know. I mean, it was never actually very well thought out. And if you ever watch the movie Grand Prix, which was shot in 1966, they actually had a Grand Prix car in the Monaco Grand Prix, and it was loaded up with cinema cameras, right? And, firing forward, backwards, sideways, you name it. I mean, it was just unbelievably ungainly because, back in those days, cameras were enormous, right? And they would allow this car to start the race behind the rest of the field. And so these guys are going through the streets of Monaco. There's no guardrails. The marshals are standing on the city sidewalks. Photographers are laying on the sidewalks with their cameras snapping pictures, which I can only imagine how dramatic it was. But I mean, there's no safety. and so when they had a few, hay bales put up, well, they were almost a nuisance almost, and like at Monaco, the hay bales were there to keep you from, missing the chicane and landing in the harbor, which, by the way, somebody managed to do. So
can I interrupt you right there and say I actually did get to watch Grand Prix? Because for any of our listeners, if they have had the chance to listen to your backstory, when we had that conversation, I asked you, what is the best movie to watch for Formula One? And you said Grand Prix. Well, I decided to wait till the holidays when there was no Formula One racing to kind of get me over the withdrawal of not having racing. So I watched
Off-season blues.
Yes, exactly. And what you just pointed out was so shocking to me because if anybody hasn't watched it, I totally endorse what Dick has said about the value of this movie. I was in the first minutes, you see what you just said of the lack of barriers. And then, of course, there is a notable crash that happens. And I was like, what were they thinking having hay bales there? Like, what did they? And then, of course, the going into the harbor, all of that. And then as the movie goes on, you start to see other iterations of what the racing looked like back then. And I was like, I'm so glad Dick told me to watch this movie. I mean, the actual narrative of the movie I can question, but the value of it was really hard to get through. But the value of what you just said of understanding the danger and the lack of safety measures. When I watched it, I was like, how did they not see what we see today? Which I think a lot of people have when we think about the past in general. But I'm really glad that you brought that up in this conversation again, because I hope our listeners will take the time to watch that and also take the time to listen to your backstory if they haven't already done that. So shameless plug for your story.
Shameless plug.
Yes.
But it's like, if you look at that movie, it's like, okay, these cars have roll bars, right? To keep the car from going on the driver's head. And yet, for most of those guys, their heads are above the roll bars. Explain to me how that works. You just look at it.
Agree.
Huh?
Like, yeah. And you do have to watch the movie for those kinds of questions more than like the Hollywood, filmmaking aspect, which is also pretty cool.
Yep.
But I agree. Like any person who wants to appreciate where we see ourselves today in the world of F1, that should lead you to asking some critical questions about how the sport has developed, which leads to why we're here today. So I interrupted you, but I'm trying to get you back into
It's all good.
groove again.
Yeah, no, it's great. And so, I was a little kid when Jim Clark died. And, I learned today when I was doing some research for this podcast, he was 32 years old when he was killed. And I can remember thinking, wow, he was really old, but now in my advanced years, I'm looking at it, I'm going, the dude didn't even start living. I mean, he did start living because he raced cars, but he really didn't start living. You know what I mean? And so it's just crazy. So 1968, not a good year. So then we moved to 1970. And in 1970, we lost 3 drivers. And it was in very rapid succession. And each one of them hit home because they were all, in some cases, the cause of their death was very similar to Clark's. And then there were other reasons as well. If you look at like airplane accidents, auto racing crashes, that kind of stuff, there's usually more than one contributing factor. It's not just one thing. It's a multiple things that come together to create a perfect storm. And 1970 was a whole lot like that. The first person who passed away was Bruce McLaren, like McLaren cars, right? And Bruce, again, was 32 years old, and he was testing his Formula One car and what's called a Can-Am car at Goodwood Racing Circuit in the UK. And Can-Am cars, if you don't know what those are or were prototype sports cars with 7-liter Chevrolet V8 engines in the back of them. And, they kind of called them the Batmobile. They were big. They were insanely powerful, really, really fast. They were actually very, very much the equal of a Formula One car in terms of outright lap time. The Formula One car would be quicker in the corners. The Can-Am car quicker in the straightaways. And they wound up making their speed in a different way, but their lap times were virtually identical. And so he was spending the day jumping back and forth between the F1 car and the Can-Am sports car, which, just think about it from those terms, how have things changed, right? You'd never see a driver doing that, but he was that day. And anyway, he was doing a shakedown run of the new McLaren Can-Am car before they were going to ship it over to the United States to contest the Can-Am series that was done here in the States, and had made several runs during the day and was finding speed in the car and just, going through a testing program. And a bodywork fastener failed on the car, and the rear bodywork came off the car as he was going down the main straightaway on the track. And when the bodywork came off, the rear wing went with it. And so all of a sudden he had no downforce, and the rear tires literally lifted off the ground. He, jumped on the brakes, but it was too little too late, went straight off the track and went straight into an unprotected flag marshal stand that was surrounded by concrete to protect the marshals. And according to what they could figure, he went from 155 miles an hour to 0 in less than 9 feet, and of course killed instantly. Wow. And so this was again a situation of both a race car failure and a circuit failure. And so, and again, 32 years old. And of course, Bruce's name lives on today with McLaren, and a really remarkable story about what the man started. It turns out that he was seriously considering retiring from driving and focusing on the business side because his business was growing so fast. And but as it was, he didn't get to do that retirement. So from there, about a month later, a gentleman named Piers Courage was driving a car built in Italy by the De Tomaso company that had been specially commissioned by none other than Frank Williams. And this particular car had a lot of magnesium componentry to keep the car as light as possible. But the thing about magnesium is that once it catches fire, it burns at a very intense temperature. And unfortunately for poor old Piers, he had a crash at Zandvoort. The car caught on fire. He was trapped in the car. And for the most part, the turn marshals had no fire extinguishers. They had nothing to get this guy out. And he literally burned to death in that car.
Oh, my.
Yeah. And in the meantime, the only way they could put it out was to throw tarps over the car and extinguish the flames. And the race continued on. They never stopped the race. They just kept going.
Wait, you just said the race continued on while this is happening?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a movie out, I think it's called One. Mm-hmm. And it's got the video of it in there of the crash and the whole thing. It's just crazy. Yeah, crazy. So again,
I guess I have just a question, because you just brought up the magnesium, because it's not, is this like a fireball? Does your research say anything like, is this like engulfing flames, or is it you can't just suppress it really quickly kind of flames? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just that they, the term marshals didn't have any fire extinguishers for some reason, which doesn't make any sense. When the fire extinguishers finally got there, the gasoline, that had originally ignited in the crash, then had gotten the magnesium going. And so now the fire was hotter than burning gasoline.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. We just can't, again, this is why I think it's worth having this conversation. We cannot today imagine marshals not having that kind of equipment.
Right. Yeah. So then a few months later, September, in practice for the Italian Grand Prix, Jochen Rindt, who was leading the world championship, driving for Lotus, he was going into the Parabolica, and we all know the Parabolica, that's the last turn at Monza. You approach it really fast, the corners are really fast, and then you go basically rocketing off of that corner and you go down that long straightaway. Well, when they got there, the Lotus was powered by a Ford Cosworth engine. It was a V8, put out about 450 horsepower. And the Ferraris that year had closer to 500 horsepower because they had a V12. And so the Ferraris were quite a bit quicker in a straight line. And so they said, well, tell you what, let's try driving the car without the rear wing on the car, because then that'll reduce the drag and we'll see, how much faster we can go. Well, sure enough, the car picked up all sorts of speed, and Rindt was able to drive it with front wings, but no rear wings. And so in practice on the next day, this would have been Saturday before qualifying, he's going down the straight leading to the Parabolica, and he goes to step on the brakes. And this car was equipped with what's called inboard brakes. If you look at a Formula One car today, you'll see the brakes when they have the wheels off. You can see the brakes sitting mounted on the suspension out by the wheel. Well, in this case, the brake discs and the calipers and everything were mounted inside the chassis of the car. And then the brake discs were connected to the front wheels by basically a drive shaft. And what happened was when he went and stepped on the brakes, one of the right drive shaft, I believe it was, sheared. And so now all of a sudden, only the left front was braking, the right front was not. And of course, the car immediately just turned left and went straight into a barrier and head on. What's interesting, well, several things are interesting about this crash in a hideous sort of way. Number one, with that rear wing off and only 450 horsepower, Rindt was caught on a radar gun doing 205 miles an hour just before he went onto the brakes. Think about that. 205 miles an hour is not that much slower than what they're doing today.
Right.
In a car that is a full-on carbon fiber with a halo and all the safety bits and pieces and a much safer racetrack and all that. And here's this guy in a much smaller, very flimsy car doing 205 miles an hour. It's just beyond my ability to comprehend. But anyway, the car turned sharp right, and once again, we had a barrier fail. And instead of the barrier stopping the car, the steel barrier, the barrier actually broke away, and he went straight on into the fence post that was holding the barrier. And when that happened, Rindt contributed to his death because he didn't like to wear the anti-submarine belts that come up between your legs and then attach into the lap belt, which were designed strictly to keep you from sliding forward in the seat in case of an accident. Well, the violence of the accident was so strong because he didn't have those anti-submarine belts. His body slid forward, and he actually slit his throat on his lap belt, and in addition had all sorts of injuries, as you can imagine, to his lower extremities. Somehow he survived the crash. He was put into an ambulance that was not equipped to take care of the driver, and he eventually died because they just didn't have the equipment necessary to give him the care that he needed. So in all four of these deaths, Jim Clark, Bruce McLaren, Piers Courage, and Jochen Rindt, we had a situation where there was certainly component failure, but there was also failure of the track to not provide like adequate runoff areas, improper barriers or non-existent barriers, and or poorly equipped marshals or emergency crews. There were no standard doctors, anything like that. And after Rindt's accident, Jackie Stewart, having seen 3 of his friends killed in 1970, and of course he was very close to Jim Clark, he's sitting there going, well, who's next, right? And so what he started insisting on was that there would be a standard medical unit at all Grand Prix with, equipped to a very certain specification for emergency room trauma kind of treatment, staffed by the same doctors that were all highly qualified in dealing with, trauma care. And so this was one of the really first big steps. Now, they hadn't figured out the barrier thing yet. They hadn't figured out really how to stop fires, but they were starting to take the steps forward to make the sport safer. And a lot of people had said when Jim Clark died, if Jim Clark can die in a Formula car, it wasn't Formula One, it was Formula Two, but if Jim Clark can die in a racing car, then what chance do the rest of us have? That's the level of esteem that he was held to. And of course, Jochen Rindt went on and he became the only guy to win the world championship posthumously. He had amassed enough points that no one could catch him with the 2 races that were remaining. And so he was the world champion, even though he was dead.
Wow. Like, I'm listening to this, and if we had a video component where people could see my face, like, I'm just shocked and in awe so much of, like, the words that keep coming my head is, like, the Wild West of the early days of Formula racing. Yeah. And not that that's bad per se, but how far in a very short period of time, unfortunately, because of these notable instances, these questions had to be presented, and like the standardization, as you noted. I mean, I'm glad that the sport decided to listen to people like Jackie Stewart and say, we're going to invest in this, we're going to do this, instead of saying, well, it is what it is, you just keep going, because that's very easy for any organization to make those kinds of statements. But for someone of his caliber to lead the charge, so that way you didn't unnecessarily lose people who have people unnecessarily lose their life, period. Doesn't matter what, we don't want anyone to unnecessarily die. Wow. I just don't think many of us who are newer to the sport fully grasp what these people in the early days did to really get us to where we are today. So thank you for that. What do you think, Dick, as a person who is, grown up watching this, is there something that you would say to our audience to acknowledge what we are in right now in this season of, a crash now, we kind of almost expect people to walk away from. It's almost the inverse.
Right. It's like, ooh, that was a big one. And they're going to be winded, and I bet they'll be sore on Monday, one of those things. But, the cars are so safe with the safety cells that are built into them, and the halo, and, what they do with the fuel system to keep fuel from leaking and all that. And, with other than the notable exception of Romain Grosjean with his big crash, cars just don't catch on fire. If they do, it's, from residual fuel in the fuel line or something like that. It's not like the fuel tank ruptures and all of a sudden 40 gallons of, high octane fuel is hitting exhaust pipes, because
that even goes to the design of the cars today also, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like, because as development and rules have changed, it's also changed the scope or the possibility of these kinds of dramatic results to come. Okay. What about the one that started this conversation really in my head, and then us talking, the Francois Cevert crash in 73. That happens after all this notable new efforts towards safety, right?
Yep. And so, Francois was absolutely being groomed to be Jackie Stewart's replacement. Early in 1973, Jackie had gone to the team owner, Ken Tyrrell, and said, hey, look, don't tell anybody, don't tell my wife, don't tell nobody, but I'm going to retire at the end of this year. And so, Sir Jackie being Sir Jackie went out and pretty much, dominated the season and had already clinched the world championship. He beat Jim Clark's record at the time. Jim Clark had tied with Juan Manuel Fangio for the most wins in a Grand Prix career at 25, and Stewart retired at 26. And so, by the end of the 73 season, he was the all-time winner of Formula One races. He had won 3 world championships, and they were going to Watkins Glen. It was the last race of the year, kind of a celebration of Stewart's championship. No one knew that he was retiring yet, but, it was kind of a celebration of an amazing season. And so in practice, Cevert was out, driving the car, and he, of course, was incredibly gifted. And he got it a little bit wrong going through the S's at Watkins Glen, which is kind of an uphill series of left and right-hand corners, very, very quick. And he went off the track and went into one of those Armco barriers that was placed in the wrong place and assembled in the wrong way. And the barrier failed, and the car went underneath the lower beam of the barrier, but the upper beam remained intact, and the upper beam decapitated Cevert. And so the first guy on the scene was Jody Scheckter, who later became a world champion. And he jumped out of the car not knowing what he was coming across. It was his first season, full season in Formula One, and he was the first to get there. And it was so bad that he threw up right there on the spot.
No.
And so anyway, what we learned is that Armco barriers are fine for street cars. I mean, we see them all the time when we're driving down the highway. Those metal barriers that are secured by a fence post. Big, heavy. I don't know, 4 or 5 inch in diameter fence post. That's an Armco barrier, basically. And so you can imagine it's one thing to hit it with your pickup truck when you're doing 60 miles an hour. That's not going to be good, but okay. But in a Formula car at 160, 170 miles an hour, And so that caused people to start saying, hey, wait a minute, what kind of barriers are we using? Shouldn't we have runoff space? In other words, where the edge of the track ends, instead of going, 2 feet and there's a barrier, what if we were to move the barriers way back so the car had a chance to slow down? And what if we put in gravel traps to slow the car down before it hit the barrier? And those kinds of things. And of course, this evolved over time because that's expensive to put in. And quite frankly, the owners of the tracks and the race promoters, they hated Jackie Stewart because he was insisting on these safety improvements, or they wouldn't race. And so the track promoters had to spend the money to bring the circuit up to better safety standards, or they weren't going to get a race. And so he was not a popular guy, but he knew that he was right, that we just couldn't afford, as the sport grew and these sporting heroes became more and more well-known, they couldn't afford for people's heroes to die. So,
I mean, I can see, listening to you, I can see why you so respect him, because that strength of conviction that he had and that sense of responsibility he probably felt as being a survivor and also achieving, he doesn't, he wants to give back and he wants to protect others. And I mean, what you're talking about, the race promoters and the racetracks, I can understand why they would be reluctant. We see that again inside of the business world, people unwilling to put the financial resources on things that you really should, but it's going to affect your bottom line. But it also, your reputation and brand will be harmed, and your customers will be harmed if you don't do those things. So it's that cost benefit analysis that I think I would be like Jackie Stewart. I want to believe that I'd be standing up for the right thing to do. Right. This seems like this was a really big moment where the sport as a whole probably really started to see this needs to continue further. Okay.
Well, and to put a little more context into this, and on the other side of the Atlantic, Watkins Glen is in the States, but I guess my point is the Indy 500 was also a place where they were killing off guys all the time. And so when you look at a Mario Andretti who raced Formula One and Indy cars in the same year, okay, this is the old deal, the moth will only fly close to the lantern for so long and eventually his wings will get burned, And there were a lot of people who were worried about him because he raced so much in the most lethal cars you could find. And in 1973 at Indianapolis, they killed off, I think in like the span of 2 weeks at that track, they killed off like 3 guys, I think. And a crewman who was run over by an ambulance who was going down pit road in the wrong direction to get to an accident where a driver had been killed. I mean, it was like one of the darkest days in racing. So if you think about it in the wider context, all the stuff that was going on in Formula One was also going on at Indianapolis. So you had people on both sides of the Atlantic trying to come up with, how do we keep these cars from catching fire? How do we keep these cars from smashing into barriers? And they were sharing information. And in the meantime, everybody had discovered aerodynamics. So guess what? Now the cars were going way faster. They were going way faster. And yet the safety standards were like what they were like 5 or 6 years before. And so it was no wonder guys were getting killed right and left.
And then I guess that this would also be in tandem with even just general road safety. Isn't this around the time where seatbelts are becoming legalized? Like it's a legal responsibility to wear them. Car. So it's like, as the sport itself is leading the way of answering some of these questions, as we've seen in other areas, its derivatives it's actually going into the public sphere of different technologies as well, understanding this better. Fascinating. I do appreciate that additional context context of IndyCar. And it does make sense what you're saying about Andretti, because the more you race, the higher the probability of something happening. That makes sense.
Yep.
And then with his amazing skill and willingness to take risk. Yeah. Okay.
You know, it was interesting. He once said years later, he was still racing. You know, that guy, I think he was 54 when he won his last IndyCar race. Think about that. People talk about Alonso at 42, which is remarkable. Don't get me wrong. Here's Andretti winning an IndyCar race, which is highly competitive, big horsepower. Back in those days, IndyCars had about 1,000 horsepower. And here's a guy, 54 years old, still that motivated, still that brave, winning a race. I mean, the guy was unbelievable. He really was. I know he was an immigrant from Italy, and the Italians claim him, but I'm sure I'm glad us Americans claim him too.
Yeah.
Guy's amazing. So the next big wreck that really hit everybody happened really, I think, about 5 months after Cevert, and that was Peter Revson, who was an American Formula One driver, had been on, he'd raced Formula One, he'd raced Indy cars, he raced in the Can-Am series, certainly had done quite a bit, actually driving for McLaren, believe it or not. And he won a couple of Grand Prix driving for McLaren when McLaren was actually entering 3 cars, not 2. Think about that one. And he decided that he had a better opportunity with an American Formula One team called Shadow. And so he went to drive for Shadow, and they had started the season off pretty well. And they went down to the Kyalami circuit in South Africa because they needed a place with good weather to do some testing before the European season got going. They'd had a couple of races down in South America and, believe it or not, in Argentina and I believe Brazil. And so they, went across the Atlantic, went to South Africa. And it's so funny when you read the account, it was Revson, the team manager, the chief mechanic, and 3 other mechanics. And that's how they went testing. And,
wow.
So, right.
That's unreal. You don't think of that small of a group could ever do in testing like that.
Right.
Wow.
No, right. And so anyway, the Shadow for 1974 was built with a lot of titanium components. And at the time, titanium was not very well known about how did you heat treat it, how did you machine it, all those sorts of things. And there was a lot of the rod ends, which are what keep the suspension on it. So the rod end basically screws into the end of a suspension component and then bolts on to the chassis. And it allows the suspension to swivel up and down with the movement on the road. And it's a very simple design, but you need to get them right. And of course, they need to be incredibly durable and strong and all that. When you think about the kind of forces that are going through that thing, it's the piece that, ultimately holds your wheels onto the chassis. And the machining on this particular rod end was not to the specification that it needed to be when you're dealing with titanium. It was actually a fairly coarse machining job that was done. And a rod end failed on any suspension. On a Formula car, you're going to have roughly 6 at a minimum. Now, you'll have more than that. You'll probably have more like 10 per corner, so 40 on a car. And anyway, one of them failed. And when it happened, the suspension collapsed. He turned sharply into an Armco barrier. Here we go again. Car kind of did a pirouette and crashed over the barriers and burst into flames. And this was another driver who was burned to death. He was trapped because there was hardly any marshals there or anything like that. There were a couple other teams that were testing, and literally other drivers stopped their cars on the side of the track and tried to get into the fire and pull him out and help him, but they couldn't do it. And so, in this case, again, those barriers were taken a look at, changes were made. Certainly the whole thing around what do we do to prevent these fuel tanks from rupturing? What do we do there? Well, what they did was they found that in the Vietnam War, Bell Helicopters had come up with a method of building a rubber bladder that would fit inside the fuel tank so that if the helicopter took enemy fire and a bullet went through the fuel tank, the tank would actually kind of self-seal itself. And so they took that technology and made the fuel bladder that you see today in our race cars. And in addition, there was times when the engine would be ripped off the back of the car because the impact was so violent that the bolts holding the engine to the car would be sheared off. Well, when the engine was ripped out of the back, the fuel hose that went from the fuel tank to the fuel injector system would go with the engine, which would just leave fuel gushing out of the fuel tank. And so they built a reverse wake check valve that was fitted into the fuel tank. So that if that hose was ripped off, just the fuel that was in the hose would have the possibility of catching fire because that check valve would seal up the gas tank. They're really ingenious. And so that's in use today.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
I mean, when you say ingenious, I'm sitting there going, this is absolutely clever.
Yep.
And what a dynamic change that had to have brought.
Yep.
When you think about cost benefit or risk analysis, it dramatically drops down the
Yep.
possibility of these massive fires in
Right.
conjunction with all the other stuff that you've said that they
Right.
would be doing about the protocols of addressing, like when the crash actually happens or the
Yep.
destruction happens. Wow.
Yep. So interesting side note. when Revson was killed, I had just finished up, I think, my freshman year in high school. And I can remember that night that I had found out about it. We had one of my classmates had a party at her house. And I don't know, there was probably 50 or 60 kids there, a typical high school kind of party. And some other people had heard about it and they asked me about it. And, what did I think and all that kind of stuff. And by that time, I had already started racing myself, and it was pretty well known that I was racing. And I said, well, there is a calculated risk there, and you either accept the risk or you don't. And if you don't accept the risk, then you just don't race. And you tend to have to turn a blind eye to what's going on, or you'd never do it. Mm-hmm. Because I had gotten really, really interested in racing right about the time that Jim Clark died. And what I learned very, very quickly is that race drivers who in some cases wound up being my heroes, they got killed, and it got killed on a regular basis. And so by the time I was 15 years old, I'd actually gotten kind of jaded to the whole thing. I was going to go and race and somebody gets killed, and it's kind of like, well, it's part of the sport. And I'm not saying that's a good thing for a kid 15 years old to be that way. But as competitive as I am, I had to do something to block it out of my mind, or I couldn't race. Mm-hmm. And it was more important for me to race because it's what I did.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so you kind of did a wonderful segue into one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which is, as a racer, help those of us who are not racers to get into the mind of someone who was racing during that generation. And you really did, because I'm sitting here thinking, like, when you know the probability of injury or death, how do you push past that fear? And also knowing how far to push is something that I really can't quite understand. I think in general in life, if we were to move out of the racing world, we all have fears, and
Sure.
we all need to take risks and choose when and how to do that. As we were preparing for this conversation, I think I told you this, I had for the first time watched the new Top Gun movie, The Maverick. The relationship between Rooster and Maverick was something that I thought, well, this is very intriguing. And it kind of makes me think of what we're talking about this generation of Formula One versus an older generation, a veteran generation, right? Where in many ways I see myself as Rooster. I'm cautious. I'm willing to do what's needed and want to step up to the plate. But but then you have people who are like the Mavericks, who are like, and that's who I think of you and John as people who are like, well, you know what? You just got to do it. You got to push past it. You got to figure out how far you can get to the edge. And that was one of the things I thought Mavericks and Rooster's relationship in the movie shows is that you just it's only by doing it can you figure out exactly how far you can do. Yep. And I wanted to ask you this question because I think that this transcends all of us, you and me and our audience, our love for Formula One. The life principle is, how do you, if you are a Rooster person, how do you become more like Mavericks, like you and John? And I think you've already given one, which is you just put it to the side and you don't let it drive you away from the thing you love. But is there anything else?
Yeah, I think, if you read the book, The Right Stuff, I don't know if you've ever read that book. It's an amazing book about the early days when they were trying to figure out how to break the sound barrier all the way through the original 7 astronauts that were selected to fly into space, right? And what was the common thread between the guys that were successful and those that were not so successful? And there was 2 things. One, the Air Force psychologist called it the uncritical willingness to accept physical risk, which I think is a really interesting phrase. And it's something that you kind of have to develop. I mean, I can tell you right now that, like, when I go race now, I realize I've got to be at work on Monday morning. And so my ability to go and take risks today is nothing like it was when I was 20. And that impacts my performance on the track, quite frankly. And I've talked about it with several of my friends who, raced back in the day and, champions and all that kind of stuff. And all of them said, oh yeah, business and family will mess your mind up, which is really interesting. Most of those guys that were racing back then, they were single because they knew that if they got married, they would lose the edge. I think that's one of them. The other one is going in and actually visualizing situations and asking yourself what could go wrong. And if it does go wrong, what am I going to do? And that's the other thing. And that's like mentally preparing yourself. It's like driving the simulator that isn't there, right? And many times we do lap visualization, right? To find better lap times and all that kind of stuff. Sure, that's something, it's the same thing, but you can also take it the other way and say, okay, if this happens, what do I do? And in the book, The Right Stuff, they give a great example of that, where there's two guys who both wound up becoming astronauts, but at the time they were test pilots at Edwards Air Force Base. And they were flying some experimental airplane, and they came in and something went wrong. And when they landed, the plane crashed. And this is an airplane, there's two of them, one sitting in front of the other one. Well, the guy in front did not eject from the aircraft, but the guy sitting in the back did. And the reason he ejected was that he knew that in this particular circumstance, there was a good shot that the engine would come right through the back of the airplane and squashing. So he ejected. But the guy at the front knew that ejecting probably was not going to save his life, and he had a better chance of survival by remaining with the aircraft. As it turned out, they were both right. But it's because they had already asked themselves the question, what if this happens? What do we do? Fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Because I'm thinking of like people that I know who are focused on survivalist kind of thing. Like if you're in a crowded place, you should be thinking about where are the exits and visualizing, if this happens, then I will do this. So that way in that those critical seconds, you're not thinking how to address it. You've already done that mental calculation. It sounds like that's what, even in the case of a racer getting into the car, to be successful and to move past fear, you need doing those kinds of things. What's the word? Puts you in a position of power to address it, it, and to know that you're setting yourself up for success as much as you can, given the fact that this is a grave thing potentially. Fascinating. Okay, well, you've helped the non-racer and me, hopefully our audience as well, to kind of understand a little better both the generation that we've been talking about, but also even you today and other racers, which I think leads us to, I think there are a couple of more crashes you wanted to note.
Just two more. And again, these are crashes that had massive impacts, forgive the pun, in the world of motorsport, in that it should have happened. What happened? We got to get better, and of course, one of them is Ayrton Senna. The San Marino Grand Prix at Imola that weekend, two drivers were killed. Roland Ratzenberger, which very few people talk about. He was killed on Friday, and Senna, on Saturday in qualifying, and Senna was killed on Sunday while leading the race. And basically what happened is that he was driving the Williams that came after the active ride car. Williams had the active suspension and hugely advanced car. Basically, it was a suspension that would respond to the imperfections of the road, the chassis rolling through the corner, whatever the case may be. And it would actually have an onboard computer that would then adjust the suspension so that the ride was always a constant. And that was banned. And so the following year, Senna finds himself in this car that, in order to keep a stable aerodynamic platform, it had to be very, very stiffly sprung. And so anyway, he was leading the race and goes into the Tamburello corner, which at the time was approached at a really high rate of speed, 200 miles an hour, something like that. And the corner itself was bloody quick, 150, 160 miles an hour. And nobody's sure what happened, but they think that what happened is because of the way the car was set up, the car bottomed out. And when it bottomed out, the airflow underneath the car quit for just a fraction of a second. But it was enough to kill all the downforce on the car. And so Senna's, he lost control of the car, goes screaming off the track and hits a concrete barrier that was placed actually quite close to the outside of the corner. It wasn't 2 feet. It was, 40 or 50 yards off the corner, but still going at that rate of speed, he hit it a hell of a lick. Now, the impact itself probably would not have killed him. It would have rung his bells for sure, but it probably would not have killed him. But what happened is that a suspension piece got knocked loose in the accident and went through his helmet and obviously speared him in the brain. And so that was the end of that career, and like Jimmy Clark, nobody believed that Senna would be somebody who would die in a Formula One car. It just wasn't going to happen. He was too good. And so with that accident, two things happened. One, barrier placement and barrier construction, again, was given another big think because, back in the 60s and early 70s, the cars were going at a top speed on the straightaways at about the same speed that the Formula One cars of today or 1994 were going. Within just a few miles an hour of each other, their top speeds were about the same. But the difference is that as the cars became more and more modern, the aerodynamics were more and more understood, the cornering speeds had gone up unbelievably, way, way higher. So the G-forces were higher, the speeds were faster. And so if something happens, then you need way more runoff room and you need to be hitting, tire bundles that are set in front of a barrier instead of just the barrier. And so, the other piece that was done as a result of this is that everybody looked at the cars and they said, drivers' heads are sticking way out of the car. We need to provide some sort of protection for the driver, at least on the sides of his helmet. And so that's when you started seeing the raised cockpits and providing more and more protection for the driver from those side impacts. The other thing that started happening is there became the requirement to have wheel tethers, so that you had these basically very, very strong steel cables, one side attached to the chassis, one side attached to the suspension upright. And the idea is to keep that, in case the suspension became detached from the car, it wouldn't go very far because that cable was there to keep it in, sort of in place and keep it from flying around. It was also really good for spectator safety too.
Yeah.
So anyway, so there was a lot that came out of Senna's accident. And as a result, Formula One went for 20 years without losing a driver. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, in 2014, at the Japanese Grand Prix, Jules Bianchi was driving in the Japanese Grand Prix, and it was raining pretty hard, as it tends to do in Japan. And another driver named Adrian Sutil, in a Sauber, actually, had gone off the track. And so there was a yellow flag in that particular corner with a rescue vehicle, kind of, one of those, it's kind of like a bulldozer, but it's got, 4 wheels instead of, Caterpillar treads on it, and it had gone and was retrieving the car out of the gravel trap. It lifted it up and had the car suspended in the air. Well, here comes Bianchi, and he hit a pretty sizable puddle at a relatively slow speed. I think he was only going 70 or 80 miles an hour, but the car hydroplaned straight off the track and went straight underneath that crane that was picking up Sutil's car. And, of course, he had head injuries and all that. And months later, he passed away from his injuries, which is incredibly tragic. And, of course, Jules is, I guess Charles Leclerc is the godson of Jules. And so anyway, as a result of Bianchi's accident, that is what led to the creation of the Halo, which, while aesthetically they're just as ugly as it can be, they've saved a bunch of people's lives. That they contributed to saving Grosjean's life. I'm sure that it's saved Charles Leclerc's life at Spa when there was that start line accident and Fernando got launched by somebody else and he went over the top of Leclerc's car. If that halo hadn't been there, Charles probably would have been killed. And then the famous coming together at Monza between Hamilton and Verstappen, where Verstappen's car wound up on top of Lewis.
Right. I would even say the most notable, most recent crash would be Zhou Guanyu, in my opinion, right?
Absolutely.
Like, that one, the halo has been so significant to his. I mean, I remember waiting, like, as we saw it, I just held my breath thinking, oh my Lord, what is happening? And I mean, it really does feel like we're in a different era, especially as you've walked us through this, that now, so 2 things. One, when you talked about Senna, I think it's fascinating that even the way that you noted some of the protective measures that had been placed, how that actually contributed in some ways to this, because this is an ever-evolving learning process and we can't foresee everything that could potentially happen, because that maybe that specific set of events has never happened, right? But once that happens, then the necessary, in my opinion, the necessary conversation is how do we prevent this from happening again? And then even with Jules Bianchi, which I think many new fans have an awareness largely because of what you pointed out, Charles Bianchi, or even 2 years ago now, Suzuka having that major water storm and Pierre getting extremely upset because of the way the signs potential repeat of what we saw happen with a recovery vehicle on the circuit trying to recover that. I don't remember who had crashed right now. But all that to say is that this level of vigilance that is needed, which I had been reading an article and I shared it with you before this conversation. I loved and it ties into what you said about Senna. They noted in the whole article that we're up on the 30th anniversary of of Ayrton and Roland's death. And they said, let's hope the forthcoming anniversaries of Ayrton and Roland's death will serve as an opportunity to reset the determination of all involved to ensure that the next 30 years pass without further loss. The race to zero fatalities is one worth winning. And I thought that was a wonderful way to remind us that this level of safety that we now see inside of the sport is vital to ensuring continued life and enjoyment of this. And I guess what I would like to ask you is, I know that we can never totally eliminate risk. I had listened to a podcast, I feel like a few years back, and it might have been Nigel Mansell. Don't quote me. Well, never quote me, but don't quote me if I'm wrong on who it was. But he stated that it's too safe. And I wondered if you think that do you agree with that? I mean, is the danger part of the allure of racing? Is it something else? Or is it worth us making sure that this is a high priority? And that's kind of a loaded question. And if you don't want to talk about it, that's totally fine. I give you that out. But I just wonder, because it's maybe the quality control person that I am that wants to really think about, I don't want to lose lives ultimately. And I'm not a racer. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I certainly don't want to see guys get killed. In addition to those guys, there was a couple of guys that I knew as when I was racing who got killed literally in front of my eyes, right? In real time, in person. And, it's nothing that you ever want to see. And so, there's a part of me that says, in some respects, you don't compromise on safety. But at the same time, if you're going to go do it, then you make sure you have all the very best safety gear. Your car is prepared to the very best possible standards. You understand where the risky parts of the track are, and then you decide, okay, am I going to do this or am I not? Right? I mean, that's what you do, and that's part of the beauty of the sport. And remember, Hemingway said that there's only really 3 real sports in the world, and that's mountain climbing, bullfighting, and auto racing, because those are what you can get killed at. Everything else is just a game. And so I think Mansell is actually kind of referring to his inner Hemingway, even though I don't know if Nige has ever actually read Hemingway. But, maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. But at the end of the day, I get where he's coming from. I mean, I was having a conversation with an old school hardcore racer just the other day, and he said, hey, all of these guys need to take a pay cut of at least 50% because none of them are at any risk of getting killed. And I was like, interesting, because, he was going on about Lewis. Apparently, Lewis's new contract is like $55 million a year or something like that. And so, he was just sort of like, and so to a degree, I get where he's coming from,
Well, especially in comparison to what you said at the very beginning. Jim Clark is passing away in a crash because he's not racing in Formula One because there's not as many races and he's got to pay his bills. Yeah. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You can see why you would want to say, let's equalize this a little bit more, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's like, I remember when Jackie Stewart commanded, I think it was for the 1973 season, actually, and he commanded a $600,000 retainer to go drive. Wow. And I mean, people were like, well, what a money grubber, and how could he do that? And it's, blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. And then, look at the salaries today, So, he understood his marketing value. And really, prior to Jackie Stewart, the only other guy that really thought like that was Sterling Moss. And he's generally thought of as the first guy to really be a pro as opposed to being, I don't want to use the term gentleman driver because those guys were, it's just got connotations that those guys don't deserve. But he was the first pro. James Hunt was the last really of the era of drivers that you saw in the 50s and the 60s. Whereas the rest of the guys were becoming more and more professional.
And Sterling Moss was in Grand Prix, if I remember correctly, the movie.
Absolutely.
He had a cameo.
Yeah. And he had, in fact, he may have driven the camera car.
Oh.
Maybe. You know what? No, that's not right. Phil Hill did.
Okay.
Our other American world champion besides Mario. But Moss, he won 18 Grand Prix, but he just never won the world championship. I mean, the guy, back in those days, you win 18 Grand Prix, you had really done something. You survived. And you were racing in seasons that only had 9 or 10 races. So you win 18 races, man. I mean, the guy was a stud.
Right. They really were. Yeah, they really were a different era back then. We can't, I guess it would be the equivalent of someone winning almost as many races as Max is winning, but, like proportionally, not point-wise. Interesting.
Yep.
Wow.
Interesting side story. In 2011, I was on a consulting engagement in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And one night got done, and I'm not sure what happened where the rest of my team was because there were several of us there, but I wound up riding by myself in a taxi back to the hotel. And we were taking this back road, and all of a sudden we came to what looked like to me a park. And the taxi driver, who, he didn't speak a lick of English. He only spoke Portuguese. And of course, I didn't speak any Portuguese, but I spoke English. Or Texan. I spoke Texan. And he gets real excited and starts pointing over at this park. And he goes, Senna mort. And I was like, oh, Senna. Well, it was the cemetery where Senna had been buried. And when he realized that I was a Senna fan, he started taking me to all these obscure places around Sao Paulo where there were these like massive murals of Senna still painted on the side of buildings and stuff like that. I mean, massive. And this was 20 years almost since he had been killed. And the next day, I'm back in the office, and the executive sponsor of the project that I was working on for the client was this very dignified, very, just really dignified Brazilian gentleman who happened to be the chief information officer of this company, which did sort of, $40 billion a year US in business. And I made mention of it and how I thought that was just an amazing experience. And he was shocked to find that an American knew who Senna was. And I said, oh yeah, I'm a big Senna fan, blah, blah, blah. And he began to tell the story of being at Senna's funeral and describing what the mood was and what Senna meant to the country, and the airplanes that were the Skyriders that came by and flew their airplanes to make, a heart out of the smoke that they were putting behind the plane. And as he began to speak, this powerful Brazilian businessman, Walter was his name, Walter just broke down in tears. And he's telling the story, there's tears streaming down his cheeks. And he was just reliving it. He was, a relatively young man at the time, but he was there among several million people who were along the pathway when they took his casket, to be buried. And man, by the time he was done, I was weeping, and but this was years later, and yet Senna was still making this massive impact on his countrymen, because at the time he was the only thing, according to Walter, that Brazilians could be proud of. Amazing. It was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely something at the Brazilian Grand Prix. I'm always appreciative that they highlight Senna and his connection to the country and the history. And like even in that article I referenced, it noted that Martin Brundle doesn't generally post a lot on his social medias, but he did actually go to the grave of Senna. And I think it's good for us, which is one of the reasons why I wanted us to have this conversation, is that we should honor the people that have passed and who have impacted the sport, and that they shouldn't just be lines, but we should take some time. Just as much as we celebrate the current field of people and what they're achieving, I think it's just respectful to learn about the people who have passed. And even if it's hard to hear some of the tragic aspects of it, I really appreciate how delicately you talked about this. That's not an easy thing, but I think it's necessary for us to understand what it was really like back then as much as we can today.
Maybe the floor of the coming generation is our shoulders.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.